For this next session, I think we have benefited so much from hearing from Commissioner William Beach of the Bureau of Labor Statistics talk about the way data is used and how it's analyzed. For this next speaker, we're going to get some exclusive hands-on exploration of the data sources that government officials and economists use to come up with the trends and the directions that different demographics are taking. So we are pleased to welcome at this point Jennifer Schramm. She's a senior advisor, a labor economist with the AARP Public Policy Institute. And you can read her bio on our program schedule. But we'll look forward to her presentation and her taking us on a journey of these government data sources. Jennifer.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, everyone. I'm going to set my timer so I don't go over. And I feel so fortunate to have just heard Commissioner Beach discussing the data. I mean, we couldn't get a better expert than Commissioner Beach himself to talk about the data the Bureau of Labor Statistics collects. And I was very excited to hear about some of the new surveys that seem to be in development and actually sound pretty close to us being able to see some of the data. So as Rachel said, and thank you, Rachel, I am the Senior Advisor for Labor Market Issues for AARP's Public Policy Institute. And I use a lot of these data tools, some that Commissioner Beach described, on a daily, monthly basis. And so my brief today was to speak with you about what data sources are available, and also some of the tools that accompany them so that they make the data usable. And I'll try to give you my thoughts on what data tools maybe make the most sense depending on what kind of beat you're working on, what kind of reporting you're doing, and when I recommend using something slightly different. And yeah, we'll just look at some of the data sources, and then we'll the third part is we will look at how maybe we can look at some of these different resources in a way that might help us get story ideas or ideas for further investigation. So let's get started. This is just the overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll do it kind of in three parts, that brief review. Then we'll break and use a couple of the data tools just to try them out. Some of you, I'm sure, are very experienced using some of these data tools, but others may not be. And I hope that when we use them, even those of you that are experienced, you might sort of look at what they're offering in a new way. And then finally, as I said, we'll talk about finding data and research-led ideas for articles and investigation. So let's begin by running through what I consider to be some of the key government surveys, and there are a lot. I mean, as you heard from Commissioner Beach, there are so many. So I'll kind of hone in on the ones that I use the most and why. So here are just a selection of the surveys that produce data that relates to employment and that you might be able to leverage for employment trends about older workers. And the one that we will talk a lot about today is the current population survey, but more on that later. And then Commissioner Beach also discussed the current employment statistics survey, and that's kind of like a partner to the current population survey because those are the two surveys that they report on every month in the employment situation report. The American Community Survey, we'll talk about that a little bit. We've heard a lot about the job openings and labor turnover survey, known as JOLTS. We've heard about that a lot lately because of this big news item of the Great Resignation. A lot of the data that goes with that is from JOLTS. And the reason is because JOLTS tracks how many people have left their jobs and also how many job openings there are. And we saw record high numbers of both of those. So that gave rise to this idea about the Great Resignation. The survey of income and program participation, we'll talk about that just briefly, just because it's such a large survey and it's also a longitudinal survey. We heard about some of the longitudinal surveys. I don't think, there are actually two. There's I kind of think of it as the baby boomer version and then the Gen X version. But I shouldn't even say that because I don't like to use generational monikers, but that's kind of an easy way to remember that. But those are the surveys that follow people, over the course of their lifetime. And it sounds like we're about to get a new cohort and a new longitudinal survey. The American Time Use Survey, we heard about that. Employee tenure, that's a useful survey sometimes, especially if you're looking at differences by age. We know older workers tend to have longer job tenure than younger workers, but it's interesting to see if there are changes over time. Employment situation of veterans can be useful from an age perspective because it looks at veterans from different wars, and can sometimes compare their experiences later in life. So, but when we're talking about current, the latest employment data, where the real, I guess you would call it the mother lode, where the gold is to mine, it's really the current population survey. That is the data source that is going to give you the most current data, the experience of employees and job seekers from the previous month. And this forms the basis of at least the population side of the monthly employment situation. So this is, it's administered by the Census Bureau, but it's run by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's a sample of about 60,000 households, and that sounds like a lot, but we'll see later. Sometimes if you really want to narrow down your data to very narrow demographics, it's not quite large enough to do that, so then we have to turn to some other types of surveys. As I said, it's conducted so that you get data on a monthly, so you're getting the previous month's data. It's all 50 states. It's the non-institutionalized population, so that's people that are not in the armed forces or in some form of institution, prisons, nursing homes, things like that. And even though some of the respondents are as young as 15, BLS only publishes data on people 16 and over. And I don't know if you'll be getting these slides in electronic form, but where you see things in red, that means it's hyperlinked and you'll be able to go directly to the page for that resource. Oh yeah, sure. But again, I don't know if someone knows that you'll be able to get these slides. So you'll be able to, okay. And that means that my efforts to link things was not in vain because a lot of these things will be linked. Okay, so the CPS also annually has some supplements. The supplement that I want to talk a little bit more about, it's the one that we use the most often. It's called the Annual Social and Economic Supplement. It's a larger sample size, as you can see, and it has some more detailed questions about social and economic characteristics of the households that it's surveying, and there is some income questions. So this can be a useful kind of adjunct to the monthly CPS data, and sometimes there's different things that we look at that we can't really get from the monthly CPS that we get from the ASEC. So I mentioned there are some larger U.S. surveys that the census undertakes, and the first one is the American Community Survey. So as I said, sometimes the current population survey is a little bit, the sample size when you narrow it down is a little bit too small for the data to be considered reliable. So in that case, we often turn to this survey, the American Community Survey. And like this, for example, we might look at if we wanted to look at a very narrow age range, especially at older ages where there's fewer people employed, so it's a smaller overall number. And we wanted to look at a particular state, especially a smaller state, we would have to turn to this survey to really be able to do that reliably. So that's how that can be useful. The only problem with doing that is that it is not as current as the current population survey. So it's looking, we'd be looking, say we wanted unemployment data for people 70 and older in Rhode Island. That's a really narrow band. I don't even know if we could get the data from the American Community Survey, but if we did, it would be for the previous year. It wouldn't be for the previous month. So that's the trade-off with those. And then this is a very interesting survey, the Survey of Income and Program Participation. It is also a large census survey. It is, the reason I think it's quite interesting and is because it's actually a panel survey. So it follows the same waves of people. It does it in waves over a period of time. It's not going back as long as the longitudinal surveys of 79 and 96, I think. But it does give us some more longitudinal survey data, so we can kind of sometimes see trends that we wouldn't necessarily see in some of these other surveys. But I don't think these are as user-friendly in terms of available data tools for someone that's just trying to come up with some ideas for a story and find some data to back it up. So that's why we'll look a lot at the current population survey when we look at the data tools, because that is really where it's at in terms of ease of use. So this is where we're going to get into actually testing ourselves in how we use some of these available data tools. And we'll look at some that are available directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but then we'll also look at some kind other portals that other organizations have developed, but they use the data sets that the government produces in order to populate their portals. So let's start with the current population survey. So I have my man behind the curtain in the back. Brian's going to help me. We are going to look at the actual data tool available on the BLS website. I'm sure some of you have used this before, but just run through a data search just on our own, just to try it and see what we come up with. And I encourage you, those of you that have a device, to go to bls.gov and test it for yourself. Let's do it together and see what we come up with. See if we all come up with the same thing, and see how easy developing these outputs can be. So if you go to bls.gov and you scroll over to where it says Data Tools, Brian, one back. And then when you go to Data Tools, you will see one screen. And if you click on that, you will see database tables and calculators by subject. Let's click on employment. And when we get to employment, we see over here, current population survey. It's right underneath labor force statistics. How are we doing? Are we seeing that? Oh, it looks different?
You just have to scroll down to the bottom of the home screen and then you can.
Oh, yeah, just a little different.
And just while we're kind of doing this, by show of hands, who does regularly use the BLS tools? Okay, well, that's good. I'm actually happy to see that because that means what we're doing now has a point to it. So I think you'll be amazed at how simple this is and how much good data you can pick up once you get used to using this. So the thing you're always going to want to, I mean, the easiest thing to work with, but you can explore it on your own, and you may find, what I found with these, using these types of tools is that everybody has their own kind of favored approach. So for the current population survey, I know some journalists, they really work the actual release itself. So they go to the release, and then they, they get a lot of information from the release itself. And then they go to the bottom of the release where all the links to the tables and charts are, and they work those links, and they find a lot of pretty granular information just from doing that. So it really depends on what your style is, but this is just one way of getting at some of this data. So just by using the tools available. So, okay, so are we all kind of seeing the labor force statistics? All right, and can we all click on the one screen? No, Brian, can you head back? You are on the JOLT survey. Okay, so we're at the labor force statistics. Yes, got it. Okay, well done. All right, so here we are. This is what we'll get. We'll get a pop-up screen. And once you see this pop-up screen, you can really see all the different demographic breakdowns, populations, age groups, and variables that are available in the tools. And you'll see it's rather a lot. So let's just do a labor force participation rate search. So we're going to start with men. So you click on men. We'll skip all the other, we'll only look at sex and age. Men, we'll go over here, we'll do 25 to 54 years. 25 to 54. And then we will go to number 7, labor force status, and just do civilian labor force participation rate. And we will take out unclick, and number 8, we'll unclick not seasonally adjusted. We're going to seasonally adjust all this data. We'll click in number 9, monthly, and we'll add it to the selection. And now do the same thing, but let's do it for some different demographics. So do the same thing for men, ages 55 and older. And Brian, you don't have to do it. We can. Now that we've got our groove, hopefully we can do it. And I don't know, Rachel, what do you think? Do we have time to add a few more? Okay, so let's do then women, but we'll only do women 25 to 54. I'm going to show you this data in a minute, so. And then when you add them all to your selection, and they all have the same seasonal parameters, you don't want to ever compare not seasonally adjusted for one group with seasonally adjusted for another, unless it's a group that seasonal adjustment is not available for, which for 65 and older is often the case because it's too small of a population. But in general, that's what you want to do. You want to be consistent. And then you just, once you've got everything for your selection, you just get the data. And you'll land on this page, this type of page where your data is all laid out. And there's more things you can do when you go to more formatting options. I won't get into that, but if you want to put all your groups together into one table, then you can do that, and that makes it easy to make like charts and graphs and things like that. So what did we find? Did we get any outputs? Was anyone able to get everything through the data tools? Okay, well, it can take some practice. Here's what we would have seen. Oh, okay, we can go back to the slides, Brian. Oh, before we look at our result, And actually, I might have jumped the gun because this was actually for later in the survey, or in the presentation. But I really like using these data tools, so I got into it a little bit early. But I wanted to tell you about the series reports. And we don't have to click into those. I have them hyperlinked just for your benefit, so you can click into it later if you want to explore those. But a series report for let's stick with the current population survey. Say you work a beat, and you you kind of write a similar article every month. The current population survey data comes out, and you kind of have to report the same data over and over again. Sometimes having a series ID can make it faster. So if you're really under the gun and you have to report something very quickly, sometimes having a series ID can eliminate those steps of clicking through the tools. So that's where the series reports can come in handy. They also sometimes are available for data searches that the data tools aren't available for because they're much narrower bundles of information. So say you work for an industry journal or something like that, and you want to look at something very specific just for your industry, a series report might be a useful way to do that. If that's something you're interested in, then I recommend looking at the series report IDs, which you can find following that link, but then confirming with one of the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPS experts, just to make sure, because we won't click into it, but when you do click into it, it's a very confusing looking spreadsheet. So you want to make sure you have the correct ID, and you probably want to check with a BLS expert to make sure that you have data that is usable, that's not so narrow that you're not drawing from some conclusions from it that maybe the data is not really, the sample is not large enough or something like that. So again, going back to what Commissioner Beach said, the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPS experts are really helpful. If you have a question or you want to get some help using the data tools or understanding the data, or maybe you have a specific data run that you're interested in, you think there might be a series ID for it, you can just email the BLS CPS data experts, and they're usually, they've always been very responsive. Okay, so that is if you want to DIY it. If you just want to bypass a lot of that, we actually run a lot of the 55 plus data every month in the AARP PPI Public Policy Institute Employment Data Digest. So this just brings it all together in one place. As soon as the data is made available on the first Friday of the month, we go into it. We run data on the employment to population ratio. We look at different age groups, labor force participation rate. You can see the graphic on the first page. That's the 55 plus unemployment rate. We do some data. We feature some data on median unemployment, length of unemployment, duration of unemployment, and we also do average duration of unemployment by different age groups. So those are all things that you might find useful if there's background data in a story, and it's just all there for you. And again, that's linked. Okay, we've already done our activity. We did our searches. We looked at different age demographics and their labor force participation rate, and let's just see what we got. So I don't know if anyone actually did all three, or if they got the same thing, but I don't know if it was what maybe you expected. So what we can look at is the first month before the pandemic officially kind of hit the labor force, which is February of 2020. So this is kind of like our benchmark month. And then looking at the most recent available data, and seeing where the differences are. So taking that first group, in February 2020, the labor force participation rate for men ages 25 to 54 was 89.2, and now it's 88.6. So we can see the difference just by percentage point difference, which is this column here. And then we can do some calculations to get it as a percentage change difference. And we can see from there which group had the biggest change. And only one demographic actually has a slightly higher labor force participation rate than in the months before the pandemic began. And that's actually women, ages 25 to 54. So is that what you would have expected? No. And which group has the largest decline in labor force participation rate? Was that what we would have expected? Yeah? I mean, some of us would, because that might be a group that was set up to do the, as Commissioner Beach was explaining, some people, when the pandemic hit, they were close to retirement age and they decided, okay, I'll just retire. And older men might have been in a better position to fully retire at that point. So that might be one of the reasons. But we don't know. We can't look at the data that we have here and know why. We can only know, okay, this is something that we're seeing. So even though some of you might be very experienced in using these data tools, I hope this little exercise helped you see, like, sometimes it's just interesting to just go in, see what the latest month is, and benchmark it against, a kind of a benchmark month, and then look at the different demographics and see if it's, what we're expecting to find. And that might not be the story. It just might be the spark that helps you figure out where your story can go. Now, some of you, I don't know, how many of you are kind of regionally based? Okay, so some of you are very much focusing on a particular region. So there are kind of more locally based data sources that you might want to be more familiar with. So one of them is called, it's actually the abbreviation, people say LAUS. That's very unpleasant sounding, but it stands for Local Area Unemployment Statistics. And so that's looking at unemployment statistics from the local, from a local standpoint. Again, that is linked there, so if you want to check out that, you can go to their landing page. But I want to tell all of you about a resource that I think maybe a lot of people don't know about. And that's something called the state LMIs, which stands for Labor Market Information. So these are labor market information websites that each state has. A lot of times they leverage data from these national surveys, but they just pull out their state outputs. And so it makes it easy. I mean, you could find this state data on the BLS website, but you'd have to kind of search around and look for your state. And I may have linked the state landing page for different, where you can click into the different states from the BLS. But a really fast and quick and easy way to find some state labor market data is just click whatever state, Alabama, LMI, and you'll find the state's labor market. And they all look different. They're not like a template. Each state has their own, but they all contain different data. Some of the larger states have a bit more data than some of the smaller states because their data sets are so big that they can maybe slice the data differently. But I think that's a really good resource. And going along with the theme of the helpful experts at the current population survey desk, each state LMI has a state labor market economist, and they're probably a great resource for interviews about local employment trends.
Jen, I had a quick question, and it's about benchmarking. When you say, let's say you wanted to compare something today to the start of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say it's unemployment,
Right.
and you want to see how trends have emerged. Do we need to go back 10 years or 5 years? In other words, was the pandemic such a phenomenon that is we're not used to seeing, and it doesn't happen that often,
Right.
that we can't really draw any strong conclusions based on unemployment or employment or anything really compared to 2 years ago versus
Yeah.
5 years ago?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the answer is it depends. If you just want to kind of get a sense of, okay, what's happened, because since those first extremely volatile months of the pandemic in terms of labor market change, because remember the employment, well, you can kind of see it in the chart on the employment data digest, that huge spike in unemployment, those first like April really of 2020. You know, so much has happened just in the pandemic years that sometimes you just want to look at, you know, that month right before the pandemic, you know, really started to show up in the labor market data, because you just kind of want to see if we're back to where we started. And that's kind of really what you're trying to gauge. On the other hand, you might be interested in, was the pandemic-led recession, how does it compare to previous recessions? How does it compare to the Great Recession? Remember, we used to call it that. Or even going all the way back to the Great Depression, because remember that unemployment rate had not been seen since the Great Depression. So for that, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics data goes all the way back to 1945. So it doesn't go back to I believe it goes, I'd have to double check the year that it goes back to, but it goes back really, really far. So you can, you know, look at a lot of recession patterns over the decades if you want to. And you can for a lot of different demographic groups, but some groups like women, there's not as much data about the female workforce when you get back to some of the earliest surveys. But so I guess if that answer makes sense, that it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at large, long-term patterns, and you want to compare like an economic recovery pattern after a recession, well, then you're going to have to go back really far, because you want to go back far enough so that you can see the start and the end of several recessions and recoveries. But what I think a lot of journalists are doing right now is they're just trying to gauge, where are we? Are we recovered from, you know, are we back to where we were when the pandemic began? And in that case, you just go back to February 2020 and look at, because that's the last month before the pandemic affected the data. Okay, so I mentioned earlier some other data portals. And I think some of you actually might have experience with with one of these in particular, and we'll look at them now. The first is IPUMS. It is a data portal that pulls survey data from, and the CPS is one of them, from different data sources, and it has tools available, I think, for comparing different surveys or connecting different surveys together. A lot of researchers use this data source or as a way to explore the data. But I think a lot of journalists actually use this second one. Have any of you ever used this Federal Reserve data portal? It's called FRED. Okay, all right, so do you use it a lot? Yeah, it's really user-friendly, isn't it? Yep. Okay, so we're going to do a data activity with Fred, because I think it will be very helpful and useful, especially if you're writing a story, you're on deadline, you need to write something quick, and you want a data visual to accompany your story. Fred is really helpful for quickly developing a data visual about some, you know, whatever it is you're looking at. So okay. My helper is on top of things. So here's Fred. This is the landing page. And as I said, it's a Federal Reserve initiative, but it's a Federal Reserve initiative of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So let's try it. It's just fred.stlouisfed.org. If you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to kind of test it along as we're doing it, it's kind of fun. And let's start. You'll see on this landing page, you can browse the data by the release, the source, tag, release calendar. We're just going to browse it by category. So you can click right on this link, category, and we'll stay with employment, and we'll stay with, let's stay with current population survey. Right, this the very first one. Yep. And let's, just for us, we'll try losers and leavers. Yeah. I feel like I'm on Jeopardy when I say it. Okay, so let's do seasonally adjusted. Let's click on job leavers as a, underneath seasonally adjusted, click the box seasonally adjusted. And then we'll do the same thing for job losers on layoff. We'll just click seasonally adjusted. And then just go to the top and add it to graph. And we've got a graph. We've got both of those. We've got job leavers as a percentage of total unemployed, job losers on layoff as a percentage of total unemployed. And of course, we've got some real interesting data right here when the pandemic hit. So how fast was that? Like, boom, you can create a data visual. And this is a great one to just explore and kind of get to know. As I said, I notice a lot of journalists embed, and they make it so user-friendly. They embed, you can download, you can edit the graph, and you can add it to one of your stories maybe. If you're interested in a particular data point, you want to illustrate it. And it's okay with your, as long as you attribute it to Fred, should be good. Okay. So are you starting to feel more confident that you can use these data tools? There's nothing, they're pretty simple to use, and they're available for all of us to use, especially journalists. So that, your stories are really data-based. You asked a great question about, you hear things in the zeitgeist, and you want to make sure that it's really has a basis in fact. And these tools are a way to do that. All right, so we did that. This is just to kind of give you a rundown of how you use Fred. You just find your category, maybe pick some subcategories, pick your data points, and you can create graphs, you can create tables. Okay, so now we're in our final stretch of what we want to talk about today, which is ideas for data-led articles and investigations. So these are just some ideas for sources you can go to that might spark some ideas. And they're database sources. So the first recommendation I have is just go to the experts themselves. Like go look at the BLS publications and see what the BLS economists are thinking about themselves. They know this data better than anybody else. And when they write an article about something, it's because they saw something in the data they thought was interesting and unique and worthy of being written about. So they have, and these are all linked, they have Economics Daily, which can be kind of shorter data points, but then they have the monthly labor review, which can be longer analysis, more in-depth analysis of kind of longer periods of data outputs. And comparing different demographics, beyond the numbers, spotlight on statistics, and reports. So there is a lot of ideas in just the BLS reports that they publish. And then the census has, I consider this kind of a blog, and they take a deep dive into their census data. And that's a good source for article ideas, I think, because, again, nobody knows this data better than the people that are actually producing it.
And America Counts is relatively new, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
I think we learned about it at the data workshop that NPF did in January, and they were sort of heralding that this new aspect was coming out.
Yeah, I think the government, places like the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census are making an effort to make the data usable. Even just since I've been working on this, the tools available, they seem to be getting more user-friendly and easier to use. Okay, the Fed has some really good resources, especially for story ideas based on the kind of economic analysis that that normal people, I include myself in that, we just can't do. Like some of these economists at the Fed are doing like really advanced economic modeling. So they have some really interesting insights, and some of the turning points or changes in our understanding of the pandemic labor market, the different changes in the labor market during different points in the pandemic. Some of the best data that kind of changed our understanding of that came from Fed economists doing analysis. So the Federal Reserve actually has its own survey. I don't know how many of you look at the survey. Yep. Oh, you're a very data savvy journalist. Okay. Yeah, this is a survey of household economics and decision making, and this is a good one for some retirement trend data, I think. Also, anything related to retirement savings, because it has data on credit access, savings, loans, different types of loans. So this is a good source for information. But then the Federal Reserve banks themselves, there are 12 Federal Reserve banks around the country, and they have all kinds of interesting and useful outputs, whether it's blog articles, in-depth reports, their own research analysis, as I said, the economic modeling, where they take existing data and kind of project it into the future and say, if this continues into the future, this is what the economic well-being of these different groups will look like. And the online speeches and events, are really useful to watch. And then another angle for stories can often be just looking at where we in the US are compared with other countries. So for this type of research, you could look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD. It has member countries that are higher income countries around the world, and can compare all kinds of different measures of the economy by different countries. And you can see where the US, like probably you've seen articles where where it compares different countries' annual leave, and that's often, I'm not sure if that's OECD. That's usually, I think, OECD data. But things like that, those types of comparisons are often using OECD data. And then the International Labor Organization also has a global reference for international labor statistics. Again, it's pooling together government data from all different governments and then kind of collecting them into one place. And then I also wanted to touch on, I think Commissioner Beach mentioned Pew, but these are some other resources, for just economic data that may use the government data, but they analyze it in their own way or for their own topics that they're researching. The National Bureau of Economic Research publishes a lot of working papers, so they might not be things that have been peer-reviewed yet, but they can be very current. So they can be looking at the latest data and making creating some ideas about potential trends. So depending on what you're interested in and what the data kind of parameters are, like that you report on, like some people or some organizations don't report on working papers, but it can give you some ideas of trends that are emerging. We mentioned Pew. That's a great resource for demographic issues and changes. Brookings Institution has the Retirement Security Project. Our own retirement expert, David John, is a Brookings Fellow, and low-income worker data. The Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis. I think we may have a speaker from SCEPA. They do very current analysis of the CPS data, especially around older workers. And the Urban Institute is interesting because they have this, they've pulled together data to create a simulation model so they can do economic modeling based on this Dynasim model that they use, and that can look at things like financial issues, health, all kinds of measures, and of importance to the older population. Another, of course, idea is to schedule maybe your stories around the release calendar. So that's always, that's probably an obvious one that you all know, but it's just worth repeating that looking at the release calendars can help you plan your stories. Like, when the veterans data comes out, well, maybe I'll write about veterans on that week. Or when the job tenure data comes out, maybe I can see, did the Great Resignation influence job tenure? Things like that. You can kind of look at what stories you're already working on or thinking about, and then look at the release calendar and see if that gives you some ideas around when to plan. So I don't know, where are we? Do we have time for a quick discussion as we wrap up?
Hi, my name's Madeline Holcomb from CNN. This might be a bit of a silly question, but in case it's not.
It's not, I'm sure.
I am really interested in the language we use when talking about different populations and how we might alienate or pigeonhole unintentionally with our words. And I know in the beginning you said you don't like to use generational monikers. I would love to hear more about why.
Well, for me, and I'm not speaking for the organization, it's just for me, I think it can be an accuracy problem because, especially when we're talking about international data, different countries had population booms at different times. So saying this is it's not the same age group that might have a shared, would make sense to have a shared moniker. So that's why I try not to do it. It's a useful shorthand, but so I sometimes do it, like as you saw today. But I try not to, because I don't think it's always very accurate. The other part of it is sometimes there's disagreement on the actual date when a generation begins and ends. So I try to avoid it myself. But I slip up because we all use them. And, it's a shorthand way of helping each other understand what we're talking about. But yeah, I try not to, actually. But that's just me personally.
Hi, Lauren Mapp, San Diego Union Tribune. Earlier you were talking about the Federal Reserve and how the 12 of them put out different reports.
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be really regional? Like for California, would I be looking at San Francisco, or do they put out different reports depending on their interests? It's both.
The different banks, depending on the region they're in, may look at regional issues. But no, they also, some of the analysis that they do covers the whole U.S. economy, and some it can be really, really useful. I refer to federal Reserve economists' data quite often. So yeah, I encourage, even if it's not in your area of the country, say you're in a region, look at all of them just from time to time if you have a moment, and just see what they're up to, because they can produce some really great stuff. Mm-hmm.
In the last session, Rebecca Knight, Business Insider. In the last session, Rachel made a point to talk about the differences in older workers who are working because they want to continue to work versus those who need to work. Do you know of any resources that we can find out that really break those two different cohorts down?
There's that's a hard one, and there's different ways to maybe do it by a proxy. So, well, first of all, there are surveys out there that ask people why they're working at older ages. We do our own survey. Our research division does our own survey where we ask people that question. Why it asks them why they're planning to work in retirement, and then when they are retired and they're retired but they're still working, asks them why. And we can look at financial issues versus social engagement and those kinds of things. So there are surveys out there. Sometimes I look at and this can go deeper into the data sometimes than the data tools can do, and then you have to look in the actually, this makes me curious. Do any of you have like data analysts on staff at your publications that can write code for you? Yeah? Okay. Well, for those of you that are fortunate enough to have that, sometimes you can ask your analyst to just go deeper into the data, and then you can look at things like education level, age, sex. Sometimes education level can be a proxy for income, because you can assume that people with the highest levels of education probably are working in jobs that pay better and that have better working conditions than people who have among the lower levels of education. And so you can do things like that. But those aren't perfect proxies, obviously. Some of the other surveys might be useful. And again, if you have analysts that can work with some of the larger surveys that have income data in them, then you can leverage some of that data.
Just over here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm with Industry Week, Laura Poutre, and I was wondering about if you have any recommendations for databases, of the ones you mentioned that you can like filter by industry sector, like if you want to specifically look at like manufacturing and whether older workers are returning to the workforce or that sort of thing.
Yeah, so as the commissioner said, when you're just really focused on industry data, it's the establishment survey that we really look at. But that, other than, it does collect data about women, but that's the only demographic data it collects. So for that, you have to use current population survey data, and that is where those series codes I mentioned, which can be kind of hard, they can be kind of challenging to use, but you can go into the series ID forms and find the population you're looking for. I think there are age and industry breakdowns. But again, those can, especially for the older ages, those can start to be very small numbers. So you may want to go and refer to an expert at working with the current population survey to make sure that you're drawing the right conclusions from whatever outputs you'd get from that.
I think we can take a few more and then
Hi, I'm Lori Valigra from the Bangor Daily News in Maine. And I wondered, when you're perusing all this data, if anything jumped out at you that ended up dramatically changing AARP policy or recommendations?
Wow, that's an intense question. I don't think so. Because I think what we saw in the pandemic was a lot of the same issues and problems that we have been dealing with for years, especially age discrimination, but it just made it many, many times worse than it had been. So the same survey I mentioned where we ask older workers why they're working at older ages, we also ask them about their experience of age discrimination, whether they've seen it or they've experienced it themselves. And we saw a very large increase during the pandemic. And now that seems to have gone down again, but of course it's still way too high. So for issues like that, I would say it didn't really change necessarily the issues we're focused on because we were already focused on them, but it just added to the urgency that we need to draw awareness to these issues.
So sort of in the same vein, is there anything that you've seen, sort of during the pandemic or post-pandemic that's been like kind of surprising, whether in the older labor force in general or, maybe a specific section of it, subsection?
One thing I saw, but I haven't looked at it lately, was that at some points during the pandemic, so older workers who have the highest levels of education are the most likely to work at older ages. And I think we talked about that in the last session because they probably enjoy more incentives to keep working, higher salary, perhaps jobs with greater social benefits that they enjoy, prestige, better working conditions. And at some points during the pandemic, we never see that change, that the most educated are the most likely to be working at older ages. But during some months, and I haven't looked at it lately, I noticed that their decline was sharply down, whereas those with lower levels of education were either holding steady or their decline wasn't as noticeable. So I'd be interested, this is the story idea, what's been happening lately, like if that remained the way it was. I mean, my thinking when I would see that was, well, those are probably the individuals that have the financial resources to just retire. And they decided, okay, I'm just going to retire now because of, how intense those especially the first months of the pandemic were. So little things like that, I will pick up in the data and wonder about. But the problem is you don't know why something is happening. You can just observe that something is happening. But that's an example of one of the things I noticed that I kind of wished I could ask a reporter to investigate for me, wonder what was going on there.
I'm wondering about your link between education and income. Given the income of, say, electricians and plumbers exceeds anything I ever will get in my life.
Yeah.
And that currently, as I understand it, people of college age are deferring or just not going to college. Do you see a change in that classist link?
Well, it was always an imperfect proxy, and it's maybe becoming even more so. Yeah. So that's a problem, and maybe some of our subsequent speakers have workarounds for that they'll enlighten you, because I'd be interested in that too. That would be something where we would have to look at new ways of how we're doing things month to month, the kind of data that we're tracking in the data digest or the quick run, data run that you would do using the data tools can't really shed that much light on what might be happening.
You had mentioned one that has a 75-year projection, one of the places that we can look for information. Would they be the place to look for that kind of information?
The 75-year projection.
Yeah. They were looking ahead. If I could read my handwriting, I could tell you what it is. But...
Maybe it's the... Oh, that's Urban's tool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Urban would be able to, they might have some modeling that looks ahead. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, whoever that voice was over there. Yeah. But those are economic models. So they're just basing their projection on what we've seen so far. But what you're describing is maybe a shift. And if something like that shifts, then what we've seen so far can't necessarily project what we'll see in the future. So that's just something to keep in mind. Yeah, that's a great question.
Wrap this session down. I want to fill in the journalists on the conversation we had before the start, which was, you feel that the BLS is the most responsive agency in terms of your work, and when you put out calls for information, BLS gets back to you. So
In particular, CPS.
right.
They're really good about just answering your questions quickly. And if you're a journalist, maybe they're even faster.
So I want to encourage all of you,
Yeah.
and particularly for me, the America Counts. I am so curious about that, and I need to look into it myself to get more acclimated to it. But I really feel like we've got an opportunity here in these sessions to expand the context of our stories and to really add depth and breadth to what we're talking about. And you've helped me certainly feel a little less intimidated by it. So I really appreciate this presentation and want to thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.